And Kirstin did her PhD at University of Sydney in Australia. And it was kind of a meta PhD because her PhD phenomenon that she was researching was the writing of PhDs. So she was looking at how it is that we disseminate the knowledge that we make during the doctoral journey and how we do that within our different disciplines in different ways. And she drew on that research for the literature review, and today she's going to talk about how it is that we communicate our study findings in a way that hopefully convinces our readers that these findings are valid, that they are real, and that they have some significance, that they make some contribution to the conversation in the field. After all, that's what doctoral education has to do. The definition in South Africa certainly is that a doctoral study needs to make a contribution at the frontiers of a field. Frontiers of a field always sounds like a battleground to me. So I prefer to think of it as a contribution to a conversation in the field, which means you need to know what the conversation is so that you can then position your contribution. For any PhD students in the room who feel a bit overwhelmed by that definition, just bear in mind the word contribution. It has to make a contribution. It can't be same old, same old. It has to take the conversation forward, but it doesn't have to blow the entire discipline out the water. It doesn't have to be Nobel Prize winning worthy. I mean, that would be great if that's what you can manage, but most of us just manage a contribution. And you know what? That's enough. That's the definition of a doctorate, contribution to the field. But not an easy thing to do. So I'm now going to hand over to Kirstin and ask her to take us through this presentation. Kirstin.
Thank you, Sue. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint.
Share your screen. Okay. I see someone saying it's, oh, okay, so it's just someone having problems with sound, but not everyone. That happens, sadly. Thank you so much, Kirstin.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much for having me today, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. So today we're going to be focusing on quite an important part of dissertation and research writing, and that is where you start taking what you learn from your research context and turning it into something that has relevance for the bigger field. So just to start to orient ourselves to this kind of writing, just to have a look at some insights from research and what research says we need to do and what's valued when it comes to constructing findings in our own research. So multiple sources and all the references that I've drawn on are shared at the end of the slideshow, so you can have a look at those later. But a lot of the research says that the use of complex theory is valued in particularly PhD writing. And but I say this with caution because it also shows that working with theory is not enough. You need to be working at both a theoretical and a contextual level. And what the research also shows is that when we use dense theory, we need to introduce it, but also to explore it and explain it in relation to our own study. So we can't just wax lyrical about theory, we actually need to put it to a use. And the research also tells us that to show an ability to build knowledge that can be decontextualized, transferred, and recontextualized into new context is a valuable aspect. And often that is done through the use of some analytical or theoretical tools and concepts. Because what that does is it helps to abstract our understandings out of the very particular context that we're working in, for example, a first year accounting tutorial, and actually extract those findings out, those meanings out, to have relevance for the wider field. And then at the end of the day, as Sue was saying, we need to be contributing to the broader conversation. So we need to be making a contribution, and that essentially just means we need to be creating links between what we have done and the knowledge we have found, and how that links to existing knowledge in the field. So essentially what we should be aiming for then is it's not one or the other, but rather a movement between these forms of knowledge. So it's the movement between the contextual knowledge and the theoretical knowledge. But that's all very well and good to know. I think we can all, it's an easy idea to have in our minds, but to be able to do that actually involves a number of steps. And these steps play an important role, particularly in writing, because it's through working through the steps that you can actually demonstrate your understanding and build convincing arguments. So essentially, those steps enable you to weave different forms of knowledge together, so that you're not jumping from your interview transcript to a theoretical concept, but actually you are weaving the two together to make a logical and coherent connection. So the focus of today is essentially how to make this move and how to use those steps in order to make links between the context of your research site or your particular case study and then the broader field. But in order to do that, we first need to just take a step back quickly and think about the forms of knowledge when we construct our findings. And there's just one concept I want to talk about briefly, and that's this idea that knowledge and the meanings we produce can be more or less context dependent. So they can be more or less dependent on a particular context in order to make sense. Okay, so and another important understanding here is that how context dependent or not meanings are is relational, and it's on a continuum. So we can't ever say that this particular meaning is very context dependent always and forever, but it is on a continuum, and these meanings shift and change over time. And I don't want to get too caught up in this idea, but just to try and make it a little bit clear, if we think of context dependency on a continuum, here in the blue I show we can move between different forms of knowledge. Some knowledge might be concrete, so really context dependent, and some other knowledge might be more abstract, or it might be more generalized. So when we're working with concrete meanings, the meanings are dependent on their context. So you can imagine if you pull a quotation from your interview transcript, whatever gets said in that quotation is said by one person at one particular point of time in one particular context. So if we just take out a sentence from that transcript, it's going to be very difficult to understand those meanings. We need to know, where was that sentence said? Who was it said by? What context were they talking in? So it's very dependent on the context where it was produced. On the flip side, an abstract meaning is not specific to any one context. So if we take an example, a theoretical construct. So if we take heteronormativity, okay, if I can say the experiences in my home reflect heteronormative ideals. I can also say that heteronormativity is playing out in South Africa. I can also say that the heteronormative discourse at Rhodes University is so and so. The idea of heteronormativity doesn't change depending on the context. That meaning, that theoretical, that abstract meaning remains fixed. I don't have to know what's happening in my own home to understand that, or in the Rhodes context to understand that. The meaning holds steady. So that's what I mean between when we're working from very concrete meanings to abstract meanings. And it's on a continuum. So that means that on that blue line here, there are different gradations of context dependency between these two extremes. And this is what we need to bridge the gap between in our writing when we start constructing findings. So then if we look at forms of knowledge in dissertations, and this really covers research writing more generally. So it's PhDs, it's master's theses, it's publications in humanities and social sciences, it's SOTL, that's a scholarship of teaching and learning. It applies, the same principles actually apply. So here we have our continuum, and what I discovered in my own research is that we have a lot of meanings that are tied into the context of our study, but then we also have another group of meanings that are tied to contexts beyond our study. So I'm using these two notions as sort of the opposite ends of the spectrum. So we're really bounded to our study. At the bottom, it's very contextualized, rich detail, and then we've got meanings and knowledge that are coming from outside of our study that we can draw on and that we can reach up to. Right, so knowing that, one thing, actually doing it in your writing, a different thing. So when we are talking about the context of your study, I like to think of it as you sort of looking down into your research site and really getting to grips with what's happening there. So when we want to produce these meanings, when we are looking at our context of study, those meanings are going to be relatively strongly dependent on whatever context we are located in, whether that's a university context, a classroom context, a tutorial context, the context of higher education more generally, whatever context it is, those meanings are going to be locked onto that. So the knowledge and the meanings created, they're going to contain details that are specific to your research context. And that's going to include a lot of rich description. So that's where the word description really comes into play, because you need to explain what your study site is, what the special, unique features of your study site are, and of your participants, and of your particular data set. So in that way, it's your specific finding, it's your data, it's what makes your study different to other studies. So those are the types of meanings that are being created there. When we start looking at contexts beyond the study, we are then drawing in outside knowledge. So this is knowledge that is less dependent on a specific context, and it is where we are starting to look out to and connect up to existing knowledge in the field. And this is all about making your knowledge relevant and useful for the broader field. So it's about moving from that context, your special, unique context, and actually lifting your knowledge that you construct within there, lifting it out up into the field more broadly. And that requires you to work at a more abstract and very often theoretical level. And that is where we start to see, where we can start, now words are escaping me, where we can really start to work towards this requirement of pushing the frontiers of a field. This is where we need to speak back to our field. We've established a gap, we've established a rationale for the study. Now we need to show how our knowledge actually speaks back to and links up to and supports or contradicts existing knowledge in the field. So those are the two broad sort of groups, if you will, of the forms of knowledge that we are dealing with when we're working in this area. So how can we actually do this? So a lot of studies on writing talk about what we need to do, but less actually give us the practical stuff of how we can actually go about doing it. So that's what I'm really hoping to do today, is to actually make explicit what those steps are that we need to be doing in order to make these links between our context and that of existing knowledge. So when we are looking towards our study, when we are building context-dependent knowledge about our special research site, we can do that in a number of ways. And the two I want to focus on today includes what I've called reproducing data in the thesis in your writing, and then including understandings of that data. So when we reproduce data in our thesis, I literally mean you are taking out chunks of your raw data. So that could be an interview transcript, it could be images if you're working with in art perhaps, it could be an excerpt from a novel or a piece of literature if you're working in English studies, but it's, and you can't see me, but it's the raw, in inverted commas, data that you are working with. So when you're actually just taking chunks and putting it into the thesis, so you're just reproducing that data. You can also do that by summarizing your data. So it's a very straightforward sort of description of your data. So that's one way that you can produce very context-dependent knowledge, that rich description. Another way, though, is that you can start generating understandings of your data. And I think this is a step that's often neglected, maybe, if that's the right word, in writing. It's very easy to produce quotes from data. It's very easy to summarize data. But now we need to start understanding it. And that's using your own knowledge. So this is not drawing on outside voices. It's not drawing on theory yet. This is really where you are grappling with your data and starting to understand it and express that understanding. So it would include instances where you are interpreting your data or you're explaining data. So you're sort of putting it into your own words to describe to your reader what you think is going on there. And then it would also be when you start developing claims. So that's a little bit stronger. So you've presented the data, you've explained what's going on there, and now you're sort of taking one step back and sort of making a claim about what you think is going on there. So that's how we can create context-dependent knowledge. And just to give you some examples there, is presenting, I'm not going to read that. It's essentially, as I said before, you literally take a chunk, a quotation maybe out of your interview data, summarizing your data. You're not really adding anything to it. You're just bringing together a bunch of data to put it in to a more sort of concise description. So you're not unpacking it at all. You're just describing what's going on there. When we start understanding that data, as I said, interpreting, that's when you start to sort of unpack what's going on there a little bit. So in this example, the author had just provided a direct quotation from her interview transcript, and then she explains what's going on there. So she says she renegotiates her earlier position on the topic, that parenting should be a team effort and not determined by gender, as evidenced by the words but and also in the first sentence. So that's where the author starts unpacking what's going on in that raw data, starts to show her understanding of what's going on. Okay, an example of when you start constructing a claim about something. This is from another thesis. So irrespective of one's level of education or occupational status, there is a vulnerability Zimbabwean male migrants experience for their quality as outsiders. So he's provided some data, he has discussed it in terms of what he thinks is going on there, he's interpreted it, and now he's sort of stepping back a little bit and making a claim around that data. All right, so that's how you build context-dependent knowledge. Now we're going to look at how we can move beyond your study and how we can start building more abstract knowledge. And again, I'm going to point to two different ways. The first is this idea of broadening the knowledge base by drawing on existing knowledge in the field. So what I mean there is that is when you start drawing on existing studies. And so you would often discuss some data, you'd make a claim from that data, and then you might link that claim out to other studies. And you often will do that to either compare and maybe to contrast. So if you found something different to somebody else, it's quite interesting to contrast those two different findings, or you might be supporting somebody's findings from in the field. So it just means that you are linking what you have found from your study out to existing studies. Okay, another way you can do that is also by drawing on theoretical concepts. And obviously that depends what kind of research you're doing, what kind of framework you're doing. So in a lot of social sciences, you would probably be drawing on both of these things, lots of theory, lots of linking to other studies that have used similar theories. Perhaps if you're working in sort of literary studies, literary criticism, you might be drawing on key thinkers there, linking it up, showing who else is working in the field, who those really key central figures are in that knowledge community. So there are some nuances happening there. All right, then we can also start advancing new knowledge in the field based on our understandings of the data that have been integrated already with existing knowledge. So advancing is something that we see towards the end of sections, perhaps, but most definitely towards the end of chapters. So this is where you start sort of summing up what you've done. And that's when you start making, it's kind of the so what moment. So you've written this whole chapter and now it's like, well, what has actually happened here? So often you will be drawing together all your empirical findings and you will be generalizing them into sort of a general claim about what this chapter, what this analysis, what this discussion has actually shown. Again, if you're working with theory and if you're trying to advance theory, this is also the place where you would start pushing against those boundaries, showing your reader that actually through the analysis you've done, you are actually advancing the theory as well as the findings. So not every thesis is going to do every single point, but these are the common moves that are made that I found that over my PhD looked at 25 exemplary PhDs across the social sciences and humanities. So they were recommended as sort of the gold standard, and all of those PhDs did these things. So it is a good indicator of what we need to be doing. So what we can do now is we can actually take these different steps and create a tool. But we're first going to go through some examples. I'm jumping ahead, sorry. All right, let's just go through these. So we've identified broadening and advancing. Just 2 examples. I'm sure the first, when you are linking up to empirical studies, that I'm sure looks very familiar to you. It's when you join on other studies in your writing. Branching to theory, here we can see Bourdieu's theory, his concept of cultural capital is being used to understand, in this particular study, this idea and identity of township boys. So a concept is being used to advance an understanding, to make an understanding of data a little bit more abstract and transferable. For advancing, this is what I was saying, that comes sort of more towards the end. This is when you are starting to generalize your findings, sort of drawing it into a conclusion. And it can also be where we start pushing back against the theoretical boundaries. So yeah, I mean, this author is saying that the findings here significantly elaborated the theoretical understanding of XYZ. So that really is towards the end of a chapter or of an article, but it's really where you really are signaling to your reader, this is what I'm pushing back and giving and contributing to the field. Okay, now we get to the tool. So I've called these context strategies, as a tool for writing, and we're going to see how it can be used. So just to just refresh, these concepts are on a continuum, and they are spread across the range. So we are moving from concrete knowledge that's very contextual. You really need to be there to understand what's going on. It's dependent on its context. And at the extreme of that sort of range would be reproducing, where you're actually just cutting and pasting sort of raw materials in. And then it goes right up to knowledge beyond the study, which is abstract and it's less dependent on the context to make sense. And then at the very extreme of that range would be advancing. But I think these two middle ranges here, the understanding and the broadening, these are really crucial in research writing. And I think we need to be putting a little bit more emphasis on them, because I think it's quite often that supervisors might say, you know, oh, this is just description, you know, where's the analysis? And what's really happening there is your writing is getting stuck down in this level. Or you might be told, oh, this is so theoretical, you just got lost in the theory. I don't even know how this has impact or how it has implications for your study. You know, you're just using theory for theory's sake. That might mean that you are sticking a bit too much here, or that you might be jumping to conclusions. You could be advancing inappropriately early. So this is just a way to understand what's happening in your writing in more explicit ways. Okay, so I'm going to keep going because I want to show you how we can use this, and then you are going to practice using this as well, and then we'll bring it back to a discussion and we can take some questions then. I think I'm just going to keep going for now, but hopefully you are still with me. Also, just to say here, this is not like groundbreaking stuff. These are practices that we all do in our writing every day. It just might be that we're not 100% aware that we're doing it. So the frustrating thing with a lot of writing practices is that they're so implicit, they're so common, they become so common sense. The better we get, the more we forget why we're good, if that makes sense. And so this is just a way to sort of pause and to think about, what are we actually doing when we link our data to findings in the field, to theoretical concepts, and how do we advance new knowledge to make a contribution. So we're just breaking it down into more explicit steps that can hopefully help us when we write. Okay, so let's see what this can do. So I'm going to use one of the dissertations that was formed my own data set, and it just so happens to come from Rhodes as well. But this was a PhD about parenthood decision-making practices of a particular group of people. So very well in the social sciences, but we will be talking about some disciplinary differences a little bit later. So I'm just going to leave this up for a few minutes for you to read through before we start looking at it in detail. Okay, so in this piece of writing, we've got quite a lot going on. This author is constructing her findings and she is using interview transcripts as the data here. So if you're not quite at the end, don't worry, because we'll be coming back to it, but just as long as you got a sort of sense for how this is being written, that's all I'm after now. So if we have a look, just a reminder, so if we go back to the tool that I introduced, that the context strategies, if we color code them and then highlight the text to see what the author is actually doing in this piece of writing, we get the following moves, if you will, sort of moves in writing, so strategies in the writing. So what is happening here is that it's quite easy to identify where reproducing is happening, because that's going to be direct quotes, and it's also going to be sort of the summaries. But in the same way, it's a good indicator of when somebody is broadening. That happens when you can see other studies being cited, so you'll see the citations coming in, or when you see theoretical concepts coming in. So what we can see in this piece of writing is that the author starts off by using outside knowledge. So she is drawing on this author who I think you pronounce Folgero. I don't know. I'm going to go with that. It's probably very wrong. But she is drawing on this author to sort of contextualize what's happening here and to explain what's happening. So she's drawing on outside knowledge at this point. She then sort of contextualizes what's coming next by showing an understanding strategy. So she says, for example, the following extract argues that parents are better able to relate to same-gender children. So she sets up an idea in blue using outside knowledge, and then through understanding, she sort of turns that idea back towards her data. And that creates a link between what's come from the outside and what she is looking in the inside of her study site. She then goes into reproducing strategy, where she gives a direct quote from her interview transcript. And then you can see in the green following that, so in this extract, Anel, who's the participant, expresses support for etc., etc. The author here actually takes quite a long time, quite a few lines of text to unpack what is going on and to explain and to interpret what is happening in that piece of quoted material, raw data, if you will, and to start generating some claims about what's happening there. So that's when she starts really putting her own flavor on what's happening, so that the reader can see how she's interpreting it and how she's generating those claims. And then at the end of that, once she's established that and shown that understanding, she then links it back to that outside idea and links it back out to contexts beyond her study again, to create a link, to show how that idea at the beginning now links back at the end. So in fact, she's almost created, if we have a look at this sort of tool, you can see here, she's sort of gone broadening, understanding, reproducing, understanding, broadening. So she's made like a U shape there, which we would describe actually as a wave. So she has, what is important here is that she has actually moved between these three levels. So we can see here with the colors, she's actually moved from blue to green to orange to green to blue. She's not stuck at one level. She's actually moving between. But in the same way, we would see, if we go back here, broadening, understanding, producing. She hasn't gone broadening. She hasn't introduced an outside idea and then jumped straight into a direct quote. That might be too big a jump to make, and it might give the impression that your writing's a bit disjointed. Instead, she has mediated that gap by first stepping down into understanding and then again stepping up into understanding before linking these two. So essentially what she's done, she's linked her data and she's linked that to outside knowledge from other studies, and she has weaved those two ranges there using understanding. So I'm hoping that's sort of making a bit of sense to you. And then another important point to mention here is she could have quite easily, so in this particular study, she was using primarily Butler's theory of performativity. She could have started with something from Butler. So she could have started on a theoretical level, and then she could have done a similar sort of pattern. She also could have started with, she could have started with a summary of the data. I think it's be a little bit unlikely that you'd start a section or with a quote or a paragraph with a quote, but you might start with reproducing, and then you might move to understanding, and then maybe only at the end you might move to broadening. So the actual, the order that you go in is not that important. The importance that I found over all 25 dissertations was that they were able to make the move between these different levels. So this is a particular way of writing in the social sciences. It's quite an explicit use of theory as well. So there is quite a lot of movement, particularly to broadening to those theoretical constructs. I had another PhD that I looked at in history, which spent much more time at the reproducing level, because a lot of the writing was drawing on sources in order to sort of to narrate a to sort of tell a story. I mean, this sounds terrible, and the historians in the group are probably going to be jumping up and down and wanting to smack me, but you're sort of telling a story in a particular way, drawing on sources. And so the history dissertations would often spend quite large chunks reproducing, but they would also then come up out of that and start generating their own understandings. And then really importantly, they would come, I sort of call it coming up for air. They would link it back to other studies in the field or link it back to other research to compare and contrast. So it doesn't really matter what discipline you're working in, and I'm speaking just about humanities and social sciences, these moves are common across all. Okay, so we're going to do a little activity to see if you can sort of make sense of what's going on with this tool. But I just want to have a look at the chat just to make sure I'm not missing something. Great, it seems like those who have commented are sort of following so far. So what we're going to do now is Sue has already emailed you a piece of text. It's a page long, and she's also emailed you, let me just go back to it. She's emailed you a version of this that I've just put onto a PDF. what I want to do now is we are going to break into breakout rooms for 20 minutes. And I'd like you to read the text that has been emailed to you. It's taken from the same dissertation. So we're still looking at decision-making practices around parenthood, just to try and keep with that theme. And I would like you to work in your groups. There are going to be 3 or 4 of you in a group. And I want you to try and see if you can use that table of strategies and highlight your text to see if you can see what the author is using there, and see if you can apply the tool that I've introduced. And then we're going to come back after 20 minutes and we're going to have a little discussion and then wrap up. So Sue, when you are ready, if you can assign some groups.
Yes, thanks. I have done that. Just I know a lot of people only signed up as the session started, so you will have to go to your email boxes and find the email, and then you'll be able to find the document that Kirstin referred to. If for some reason you didn't get it, please can one of the people in the group, whoever's in your group, you will only be 3 or 4 in the room, can one of you perhaps click on the share screen and open the document, and then you'll all be able to, so as long as one person in your group has got the document, which I've sent by email, they'll be able to open that document on their own computer, then come to Zoom and press share screen, and it'll have that document as an option to share. You need to open the document first, then come to Zoom and click share screen. Hopefully that makes sense. You're about to be thrown into rooms of 3 or 4 people for 20 minutes. Now, if you look on your screen, you should be able to find a button inviting you to join a room. If you've already got other documents open, Word documents or whatever, you may find that the invitation is kind of hidden behind some other document. So you may need to do a little bit of looking around. If you can still hear me, it means you haven't moved into your room yet. So just have a look around. Somewhere on your screen, you should see an invitation to join a room. Okay, I've still got a few people with me. If you get stuck, just pop in the chat and let me know that you're stuck and I can try and help you. In the room. Oh, Taryn, something went wrong with you. I'm going to try you again. Taryn, you should see an invitation now. Maybe it's a different room than the one you were in. So I've got Moses, Tabisa, and Tato still with me. Moses, Tabisa, and Tato, if you can hear me, if you would like to move into a small group discussion, just have a look around on your screen. It might be hidden behind another open window. Have a look for an invitation to join a small group. Okay, I don't know if you can, Tabisa and Tato, the only ones that are left. If you have a look on your screen, you should see an invitation to join a group. Oh. Hi, Cephas. I'm not sure if you were here before and maybe got thrown out of the room you were in, or if you've only joined us now. But people are working in small groups. Only a few minutes left, I think 7 minutes left. So I'm going to put you in a group. I don't know, I can't seem to give you a microphone, but you can type into the chat bar if you like, just to let me know. Because I don't know if you were already in a group, I'm not sure if you remember what group number you were. Then I can put you back into that same group. If you don't remember, or if you weren't here before, I'll just put you into any arbitrary group and you can at least just participate in a few minutes conversation. And if you want to just type into the chat bar, because I don't think you've got a microphone by the looks of it. So type into the chat bar and let me know if you were in a group. Do you remember the group number? Oh, and George is also here. I think, George, you've probably also been thrown out of your room. I don't know if you remember what room you were in. I can put you back in that room.
I was in room 12.
12, that's Cephas talking, eh?
Yes, yes.
12. Okay, perfect. I'm going to put you back there right now. Room 12. There you go. It should show up on your screen now. And you'll be able to click on that link and go back. Can you see the invitation somewhere on your screen? And then George, I don't know if you remember what room you were in. I can put you back in the room. We unmute you. Oh. No, seems like you're muted. If you can't use the microphone to tell me, you can always just tap in the chat bar. I was just wondering if you remember what room you were in, so I can put you back into that room. Otherwise, I can always just put you into any room. Might be a bit strange. Hi, George. There, I can hear you.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I'm so happy now. I'm trying to look at the strategies, the context strategies, and I'm looking at what we practice as supervisors and how our students also respond to the same. I want to report that a lot of times we do
George?
only the context of the study. Yes.
Were you in? No, yeah, but I want to put you back into your room. Do you remember? Because you've been thrown out of your room, I'm afraid. Do you remember what room you were in?
Room 4.
Room 4. Okay, I'm putting you back into room 4 right now. You'll be back. You should see the invitation now to go back into your room. Sorry about that. I don't know why the computer threw you out. You should see an invitation now somewhere. It might be hidden behind a screen to take you back to room 4. Okay, everyone's coming back into the main room. We're just waiting for the last few groups to finish off. So welcome back to the main room. I hope it was a useful conversation. There's still quite a lot of people chatting till the last second. So they will be thrown back into our room now. They've got 5 seconds left. So I'm sure, there we go. And everyone is being thrown back unceremoniously into our main room.
Mayonga, you're still okay?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
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 Hi.
Welcome back.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. Sue, are you
Thank
still
you.
with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, great. So I think let's mute everyone just for a little bit longer.
Okay,
And then we will
I'll mute you as well. So just 1 second and then I'll unmute you.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Great. All right. So I'm hoping you had some good discussion in your groups and that you were able to see sort of how the tool can work in more practical terms. So I thought I'd just include the text that we went over in that task and just see if we're sort of on the sort of same line. So I've cut out extract 2 and 3 just so that I could make some space on the slide. And I've included the categories down the right-hand side so that we don't have to keep those names and colors in our heads. So that's a reminder of what's happening there. So I want you to have a look at this and think about if it sort of corresponds to what you had in your groups, the way you coded things. And this is really not a test to see if you're right or wrong with coding. That was my test in my own PhD. But this is what I sort of interpreted it to be. Maybe you understood some of the green as being the orange. But yeah, so I'm hoping you sort of got the sense. But what is interesting here again is that this is a different piece of writing from the same dissertation, and it's from a different section of that dissertation, but still making up the findings sort of chunk of the dissertation as a whole. And what you can see here is that movement between the colors, between those different strategies, is quite similar to that first text that we worked through together. And so here, I understood this as she sort of starts by orientating the reader to explaining what's been happening. She sort of sets the scene with her own understanding. And then in my mind, she sort of makes a shift when we come to this line here, which is really doing quite a lot of linking work. The following extracts illustrate the construal of having children as chiefly a matter of timing. So in my mind, what she has done is she's explained something here. She's made a couple of claims, actually. And now she is moving into the raw data as her evidence. So I'm sure if you've been to other workshops by Sue and other writing workshops, this idea of claims and evidence is really important. And a lot of the evidence work when you are constructing your findings is going to be your data. So you'll be making claims based on what your data shows and your understanding of that data. And so it's quite important to sort of strike a balance. I mean, on the one hand, you can't hand in a thesis with raw data that's unmediated by you. You can't expect your reader to read your raw interview transcripts and come up with their understanding on their own. But in the same token, I think you'll run into problems if you just interpret and explain and claim without showing what you're basing that interpretation and explanation and claim on. So it's quite important to start thinking about your data as evidence as well. So here we have a sort of an opening explanation, some claims. She links it. She's going to say, she says the following extract. So she's saying to her reader, I'm now going to show you what I mean. She gives some of the raw data. And then what is really quite interesting here is that she doesn't then just quickly proceed to other knowledge from outside the study. She explains that data a little bit more for her reader. So she mediates that data. She sets it up, she gives the evidence, then she explains that evidence, and then she actually links it out to other studies in the field. She gives a little bit more evidence through a direct quote from her data. She explains it again. So as I mentioned earlier, the choice to become a parent is almost implied. And then she links that again to existing research in the field. A little bit more evidence down here from Quis. She explains it, a little bit more evidence, and she explains it. So she is constantly moving between these different levels of knowledge, these different forms of knowledge. And in my breakout room, Lemmy raised a really interesting question, and he said, where does voice come in? Where does an author's voice come in terms of these different strategies that I've identified today? And I would really like to actually open this up and maybe hear your views, because I sort of see voice, a lot of the voice work is being done in the understanding, because in my mind, that's where you are making sense of your data. And it's sort of like the boiler room of your voice production. And then you strengthen your voice and you give credibility to your voice and legitimacy to your voice when you start moving out and broadening it and linking it to other studies and using theory to strengthen it. So that's my understanding, but I would really like to, at this point, hear some other understandings. So
shall I suggest
yes.
if anyone would like to add a comment to that idea of voice and how voice relates to the concepts Kirstin's provided us, please just pop them into the chat bar or put the letter M in the chat bar for microphone, and then I'll unmute you and you can talk. So either put the letter M in the microphone, put the letter M in the chat bar, or you can type in your comment. And I can already see that Carol Bertram from UKZN, I've unmuted you, Carol.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Kirstin, for a really useful tool. I think I would agree that that's where the student's voice comes through, is in the understanding. I just wanted to pick up this issue. Can you see how the student has bolded certain points in the reproduction of data? And I thought that was really interesting, because it's kind of a combination of reproducing the data, but not just reproducing. The writer is also highlighting the way in which she has interpreted that data. So she's bolded those particular points to kind of, I guess, strengthen her claim for her interpretation of the data. So I thought that was quite an interesting strategy, I guess, of both reproducing data and, in a sense, showing your own interpretation of it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. That is a very interesting point, and she does it throughout the thesis as well. So it's definitely a strategy that she's using, and I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of it's almost giving a taste of what that understanding is going to be, that's going to follow, or what she's setting it up, so that you kind of go in. So once you hit that raw data, you kind of know where she's pointing you to things that she wants you to see. So in my mind, it's actually quite an art, actually, or a craft, that she's sort of pointing the reader into a particular reading that she wants them to see. So it's a very very interesting rhetorical strategy.
If anyone else would like to pop a M into the chat bar, please do so. I just want to pick up on something that I actually did type in there. It's my experience that the understanding part is not as easy as perhaps one might think, because I think that's what students often get wrong. So they'll put a direct data quote, as you've got in the brown there, and then they tell us what that data quote said. And it's like, hey, I've just read the data quote. Why are you telling me what they said? So they'll say, let's use your examples. So they'll have that Gerard quote, and then they'll say, in this extract, Gerard is making clear that he's not sure when the right time is. And so they're just describing the quote, whereas understanding, as your example clearly shows, is definitely a step towards that more abstracted level. It's still very much in the context, it's still very much talking about the data, but it's taking it as a slightly more abstracted, not the actual words and incidents that the person's just given. I find that's a challenge for most students.
Yeah, I think you're really right, Sue. And when we think of these different steps, try and think of it as you starting in reproducing and taking one step away from your context each time. So when you are reproducing, your feet are in, it's like they're in the dirt of your study. When you are understanding, you've taken one step away from that. So you've got a little bit of perspective, and that's when you start to make sense of things. But it needs to be making sense of things for a purpose. And I think that's where that idea that you're moving from an interpretation to a claim. And I think maybe, Sue, I don't know if I'm speaking in riddles or circles here, but my sense is what you're saying is that they're getting stuck at just explaining, and they're not actually taking it further to like generate a claim and then showing why that claim is useful by perhaps linking it up to knowledge or interpreting that theoretically.
Absolutely. And I think your giving us these steps really helps us to understand, although you very clearly said it doesn't happen in a 1, 2, 3, 4 way, but just this idea. And that certainly came through in that research that I did with Joanne Forster and Lynn Quinn, where we analysed examiners' reports, PhD examiners' reports. So we were reading these reports that were telling students, this is what we value, you did this very well, or you didn't do this very well. And it was so clear that both, it seems almost contradictory, but what the examiners really lacked is they wanted to hear the rich description of the context, the time and space and the people that were providing the data, the very real muddy messiness of having your feet on the ground. But they also wanted to see how the researcher could use that rich context to be able to contribute to a conversation that is international, that is far more abstracted, that your readers are, in fact, your readers might be in Spain or Switzerland or Swaziland, they want to hear the rich context of your second year accounting class at University of Witwatersrand. They want to hear about that context. But the benefit of them reading about that context must be some abstracted contribution to the conversations that'll make sense and help them in Switzerland or Swaziland, wherever they are.
Yeah. And also to say that, and while there's no one right way of doing it, as I said earlier, you can start sort of at the bottom or start more with outside knowledge. The way you structure your writing and your thesis will also impact on that. So some social sciences theses have a chapter, they will have 2 data chapters, and one is findings and one is discussion, or one is, you know, they really split them out. So it's like more raw data in the one, and then they unpack it in a whole different chapter. So their pattern of strategy use will look different, but they still have to make those connections. They still have to show that movement in order to show how that contextual knowledge actually has implications for something bigger than just that context. So unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter recipe I can give you. It's more just a tool for thinking through these issues.
I know you want to wrap up, and we do need to wrap up, but there's been quite a lot of conversation about voice in the chat, and I'd just like to pick up that very quickly, because we did talk about that quite a lot in a seminar the other day. But I think that there is, in fact, I think the word voice is very misleading, because often people think it means that a voice means your opinion, and that's not what it means at all. So it's just because you start a sentence with I believe, or I think, or I argue, that's not, in fact, that particular construction is considered fairly weak. Well, that's what you believe. Why should I care about what you believe? That voice is actually, I think, the ability to construct a convincing argument. So your voice, you can use the literature and have a literature review chapter where it's really much reflecting on literature. So it's other people's voices, but you can do it in a way that has your own very strong voice by showing how you weave together the different understandings, or how you are preparing your reader through your literature review for what comes next. And in terms of what you've presented to us today, I would say that the voice is very much in terms of using these moves that you've given us from the contextual to the abstract in a way that is fairly convincing and commanding. I would say that's voice. Would you?
I agree, Sue. I think for me, voice is also, it's a hard concept to try and work with. But for me, it's like the confidence and the control that you assert on your writing. So when you're doing your literature review, it's that idea of being around the dinner table and saying, okay, you can speak, and now you can speak, and then I'm going to bring your 2 points together in the constructing findings, and that it touches on what Taryn is asking there, those transition words. For me, it's your control over what's happening. So I'm making this claim, and now I'm going to show you the evidence. And now I'm going to explain that a little bit more, and I'm going to link it up, because if you didn't believe me then, I'm going to show you how this other author from a different context has shown the same thing. So therefore, my argument is a robust one, because, but obviously, you know, you don't have to say all of this explicitly, but I think it's how much sort of control you take over, and the confidence that you have to sort of be the conductor and invite certain parts in an order and a logical way that makes sense for you. And to me, that's very much part of voice.
Thank you so much, Kirstin. I found this very helpful. Is there any last comments before I wrap up?
Yeah, and the references when you share, Sue, they are all there, including your paper with Lynn and Jan.
Thank you so much. I can see from the comments in the chat bar that people have found this very useful. I can't remember who it was, but they said, you know, it might be a good thing to use at the kind of editing stage. So don't try and use it as as a formula to try and force you in your writing, but rather once you've tried and written a section on the findings, to go back and almost analyze your own writing using these stages. And I think that would be really useful to sort of use your coding scheme on a draft of our own findings and see whether we've made these moves in ways that allow the reader to see the richness of your context, but also the abstracted contribution to the field. Really hugely useful session, I think. I think I speak for everyone. I'm going to unmute everyone so that everyone can say farewell, and thank you for keeping us company.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.